Welcome back, everyone. We're diving into something pretty unique today.
Hmm.
Um, Joyce on National Deliverance, The View from 1907 Trieste.
Oh, well.
It's an academic paper. It looks at how being in Trieste in 1907, of all places, might have shaped how James Joyce viewed Irish nationalism.
Mm.
It really makes you think, could where you live actually change how you see your own country?
It's a fascinating question, yeah.
Yeah.
Most people don't connect Trieste with Joyce in Ireland right away, but there's more to it than you'd think.
So set the scene for us. What was Trieste like back then in 1907?
Imagine this, a city right on the edge of empires, a real mix of Italian and Austrian cultures, and it's 1907. So there's this political tension, especially with irredentism going strong.
Irredentism.
Yeah, the movement to make Trieste part of Italy.
So Joyce is right there in the middle of all this talk about national identity and political struggles, something he knew well from Ireland, too.
Exactly. And here's the really interesting part. Joyce was invited to give public lectures on Ireland by both sides,
Both sides.
both pro-Italian and pro-Austrian groups.
That's kind of ironic, isn't it? They're on opposite sides of this heated debate, but both want to hear from this young Irish writer. What do you think they saw in him?
I think it shows Joyce was already good at navigating tricky politics. Yeah. Even then, he wasn't just picking a side. He was showing he understood the issues, from different angles. That ability to see multiple perspectives becomes a big part of his later work.
It's amazing to think he was grappling with these ideas so early on, before his famous novels. Did he see any parallels, do you think, between Trieste and what was happening back in Ireland?
Absolutely. Both were under foreign rule, both had their own cultures that were being suppressed, and both had this deep desire for self-determination, to decide their own fate. Joyce actually made these parallels between the irredentist struggle and Ireland's fight for independence.
So he wasn't giving some neutral history lecture. He was connecting it to what his audience in Trieste was living through.
Exactly. And what's even more interesting is that his writings from this time weren't just blindly pro-Irish. He was critiquing different approaches to Irish nationalism.
Wait, he was critiquing his own side. That's not what I expected. What kind of criticisms was he making?
Well, he was skeptical of violent uprisings, but he also doubted if just working through Parliament would be effective.
So both extremes.
Yeah. He even criticized the Catholic Church's influence in Ireland, which was pretty bold back then.
It sounds like he was already an independent thinker, not just following the crowd. Do we have any specific examples of his writing from this time that really show these complex views?
There's this really insightful article he wrote in 1907
Okay.
for the Piccolo della Sera newspaper called Home Rule Comes of Age. It was published right after the British government proposed a limited home rule bill for Ireland.
So on the surface, it seemed like a step towards independence. You'd think Irish nationalists would be happy. What was Joyce's take?
Oh, he was incredibly cynical about it.
Really?
He saw it as England trying to keep control while looking like they were giving something up. He even compared it to another case that highlighted how unfairly Ireland was treated, the case of Miles Joyce.
Okay, now I'm really intrigued. Who was Miles Joyce, and how does he fit into all of this?
So Miles Joyce was this Irishman who was wrongly convicted and executed.
Oh.
It was a very controversial court case.
Oh.
The details are complicated, but for Joyce, it became this powerful metaphor, for how Ireland was struggling to be heard and understood fairly.
So he's connecting this real-life case to the bigger political situation, showing the power dynamics between Ireland and England.
Exactly. And he's not just repeating the usual Irish nationalist talking points, he's presenting a more nuanced perspective, one that acknowledges how complex and unfair the situation was.
It makes you wonder, was he tailoring his message for his audience in Trieste? Would these arguments resonate more with people who were also living under imperial rule?
It's a great question.
Yeah.
He definitely challenged stereotypes about the Irish, like that they were all violent, which the English press often said, but he also pushed back against those overly romantic views of Irish history.
So he was trying to be balanced, giving a more complete and accurate picture of Ireland to his audience.
He was walking a fine line, that's for sure, trying to get them to understand and have empathy for Ireland's situation, without resorting to easy narratives or propaganda.
That's what's so fascinating about this period. We're seeing the development of a truly unique voice, someone who isn't afraid to challenge assumptions and grapple with tough questions.
And all of this is happening in Trieste, a city that's also trying to figure out its own identity and where it belongs. It's like these two struggles are reflecting each other, shaping Joyce's perspective in these really profound ways.
It makes me think about how our surroundings affect us, how the places we live can shape our worldview, even without us realizing it. Did Joyce's time in Trieste have a lasting impact on how he wrote, his literary voice?
I think it definitely did. He was exposed to so many different languages and cultures in Trieste. It was a truly cosmopolitan environment, a world away from Dublin.
So it was more than just moving somewhere new. It was a cultural shift that made him see the world in new ways.
Exactly. I think we can see echoes of this experience in how rich and complex his language becomes, how he plays with different voices and dialects. It's like Trieste unlocked a whole new dimension in his writing.
It's incredible to think that this period in Trieste, which isn't always talked about in Joyce's scholarship, had such a huge impact on him as a writer and a thinker.
It shows that sometimes you need to step out of your comfort zone to immerse yourself in a totally different environment. That's how you really understand yourself and the world around you.
This makes me think about those lectures he gave on Ireland. What exactly was he telling his Triestine audiences? What were his main points?
Well, it's interesting because remember, he was invited by both Italian and Austrian groups. So he had to find a way to appeal to both sides of this political divide.
He couldn't just preach to the choir, so to speak. He had to find some common ground.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And from what we know, he focused on challenging those stereotypes about the Irish,
Yeah.
presenting a more nuanced view of their history and culture.
He was almost like a cultural ambassador, then trying to bridge the gap between Ireland and this European audience.
Yeah, and he did it with that wit and intelligence he was known for. He talked about the long history of Irish scholarship and learning, highlighting people like Johannes Scotus Erigena and John Duns Scotus.
Those are not names I remember from history class.
Right, but they were very influential philosophers and theologians.
Mm.
And Joyce wanted to remind his audience that Ireland had a rich intellectual tradition going back centuries. He was reclaiming Ireland's place in European intellectual history.
So he was fighting that image of the Irish as just simple peasants or rebels.
Right. He was showing them there was more to this story, this deeper cultural and intellectual depth.
I see. And he also talked about the Irish revival, right? That cultural movement happening in Ireland at the time, all about rediscovering traditional Irish art, music, and literature.
Yeah, it was like a cultural renaissance, a reawakening of Irish identity.
And Joyce saw this as a way of asserting Irish identity against British rule.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And showing his audience that Ireland wasn't just a colony, but a nation with its own unique culture and history.
Did he talk about the current political situation in Ireland, too? I imagine that would have been a sensitive topic, given his audience.
He did, but he was always careful to present a balanced view. He criticized both the British government and the more extreme parts of the Irish nationalist movement. He didn't shy away from the complexity of it all, the debates within the movement, the different approaches to achieving independence.
It sounds like he was walking a tightrope, trying to appeal to both Italians and Austrians while staying true to his own complex views.
He was a master at that, navigating those gray areas, finding common ground while still making people think.
It's interesting how he connected the Irish struggle for independence with the Italian Risorgimento, their movement for unification. It makes me think he was seeing these national movements as part of a bigger European context.
Exactly. He wasn't just focused on Ireland in isolation. He was drawing connections, seeing parallels, recognizing these shared struggles against foreign rule and for self-determination that were happening all over Europe.
It's like he was developing a more internationalist perspective, recognizing how interconnected these different national struggles were.
Precisely. And this broader worldview would have a big impact on his later work. He wasn't just an Irish writer. He was a European writer, a citizen of the world, grappling with universal themes of identity, power, and freedom.
It's amazing how much this short period in Trieste, which is often overshadowed by his later years in Paris, shaped his development both as a writer and as a thinker.
It was a crucial time for him, a time of intense intellectual and creative growth. And what makes it even more intriguing is that it's also when he first encountered a new political ideology that would stay with him. Socialism.
Socialism. That adds a whole new layer to this story. So he's moving beyond purely nationalistic ideas now.
Yes. He's starting to think about broader social and economic issues. He was exposed to socialist ideas through the Triestine intellectuals and activists he knew. Many of them were involved in the growing labor movement.
Did he fully embrace this new ideology? Was he ready to become a card-carrying socialist?
Not quite. Joyce was always a complex and independent thinker. He never fully aligned himself with any one political movement, but socialism did make him think more deeply about social justice, economic inequality, and the struggles of the working class.
These are definitely themes that come up in his later works, especially in Ulysses. So Trieste wasn't just shaping his views on Ireland, it was expanding his whole worldview, how he understood the forces that shape society.
It was like a new lens that let him see the world differently, helping him recognize how personal experience, political struggle, and social change are all connected.
It's fascinating how these seemingly separate threads, Irish nationalism, Triestine politics, socialist ideas, are all coming together in Joyce's mind during this time.
It's like a tapestry being woven, each thread adding another layer of complexity and richness.
It makes me wonder, did his changing political views, his growing interest in social justice, affect his relationship with the Irish nationalist movement back home?
That's where things get really interesting. You see, while Joyce was in Trieste, he was actually in touch with a key figure in the Irish nationalist movement, Arthur Griffith.
Arthur Griffith, the founder of Sinn Féin. That seems like an odd connection, given how skeptical Joyce was becoming of traditional Irish nationalism.
It does, doesn't it? But this is where the complexities of Joyce's thinking really show up. He wasn't just rejecting Irish nationalism completely. He was searching for a new way forward, one that acknowledged the social and economic side of the struggle. And in Griffith's ideas, he saw a glimmer of possibility.
Okay, now I'm really hooked. Tell me everything you know about this Joyce-Griffith connection. How did it come about, and what impact did it have on Joyce's thinking?
Well, it all started with a letter. It was from Joyce's brother Stanislaus, back in Dublin. Now, Stanislaus was a big supporter of Arthur Griffith and his Sinn Féin movement, the one advocating for Irish independence. He really urged Joyce to read Griffith's work and think about his ideas.
So what did Joyce do? Did he just ignore it, or was there something about Griffith that piqued his interest?
He actually took his brother's advice and started reading Griffith's stuff. And remember, Joyce was already questioning those traditional approaches to Irish nationalism. He was looking for a new path, something beyond just swapping British rule for another kind of domination.
So he was open to new ideas, even from someone he might not have agreed with entirely. What did Griffith propose that caught Joyce's attention?
Griffith was all about this dual monarchy for Ireland, sort of like how Austria and Hungary were at the time. He argued that Ireland could have some autonomy but still be part of a bigger structure.
So not complete separation, but a more balanced partnership. Did that appeal to Joyce?
It did. He saw it as a potential solution, a way to bring those seemingly opposite forces together. And it's interesting to think about him being in Trieste, a city also caught between two empires.
You're right, that parallel is striking. Both Trieste and Ireland were trying to figure out how to assert themselves within these larger, more powerful entities. Maybe seeing this play out in Trieste made Griffith's dual monarchy idea seem more realistic to Joyce.
It's possible Joyce was always drawn to complex ideas, and he wasn't afraid to think outside the box. But it's important to remember he never fully converted to the whole Sinn Féin thing.
So if he wasn't ready to completely embrace Griffith's vision, what did he do? Just keep it to himself?
Not quite. He actually started distributing copies of Griffith's newspaper, Sinn Féin, to his friends and colleagues in Trieste.
Really? That's pretty surprising. He was promoting Griffith's ideas, even if he didn't agree with everything. It shows a certain level of commitment, a willingness to engage with different viewpoints and try new things.
Absolutely. Joyce loved a good debate. And Trieste became this space where he could explore these new political ideas and see how they landed with his diverse group of friends and colleagues.
So Trieste is like this mini laboratory where Irish nationalism bumps into Austro-Hungarian politics and the growing socialist movement. That's quite a mix of ideas.
It was a real melting pot of intellectual and political energy, and Joyce was right in the center of it. He was absorbing all these influences, mixing them up, and shaping his own unique way of looking at the world.
It's clear that this time in Trieste was much more than just a pit stop for Joyce. It was a crucible where his ideas were formed, his political awareness grew, and his voice as a writer started to emerge.
It's also important to remember that Joyce's time in Trieste wasn't all about intellectual and political stuff. It was also a period of personal growth for him.
That's a good point. We've been focused on the big ideas, the political and historical context. But what about Joyce the man? How did this experience shape him personally?
Well, he got to Trieste as a young, kind of idealistic guy. He was still figuring out who he was as a writer, and he was wrestling with his Irish identity. Trieste forced him to confront all of that.
So it was challenging, a time of self-reflection and growth.
It was living in a foreign country, speaking a new language, surrounded by different customs and beliefs. He had to adapt, learn new ways of seeing the world, and question what he thought he knew.
And he's doing all of this while trying to make it as a writer, to hone his craft. It must have been incredibly intense creatively.
It was. The challenges, the experiences, the people he met, they all fed into his writing, shaping his style, his voice, how he saw the world.
I'm starting to see Trieste not just as a city, but as a character in Joyce's story. It played a crucial role in his transformation from this aspiring writer to the literary giant we know today.
That's a beautiful way to put it. It makes you wonder how his life and his work might have been different if he'd never gone to Trieste.
Would he still be the James Joyce we know? Would we have Ulysses in Finnegan's Wake? It's fascinating to think about.
Absolutely fascinating. It's impossible to know for sure, but I think it's safe to say Trieste had a huge impact on him. It opened up his world, deepened his understanding, and really ignited his creativity.
It's amazing how one place can have such a deep effect on someone's life and work. And it makes me think about everyone listening, about the places that have shaped our own paths.
That's a great thought. We all carry the echoes of where we've been, what we've experienced. They make us who we are, how we see things, and the stories we tell.
Speaking of stories, you mentioned there was one more interesting part of Joyce's time in Trieste we haven't talked about yet.
Oh, right. It's a good one. See, Joyce's connection with Arthur Griffith and Sinn Féin wasn't the only unexpected one he made during this time. He also became close friends with a well-known Italian writer and intellectual who introduced him to a whole new world of ideas and art movements.
Okay, now I'm really intrigued. Who was this mysterious figure, and how did they influence Joyce?
His name was Italo Svevo, and his influence on Joyce was huge.
Italo Svevo, not a name I'm familiar with. What made him so special, and why was Joyce drawn to him?
Well, Svevo was an interesting guy, kind of an outsider in the Italian literary scene. He was a businessman by day, writer by night. His work dealt with things like alienation, self-deception, all the complexities of modern life.
Sounds like they had a lot in common, both navigating these different worlds, different identities. How did Svevo influence Joyce's writing, would you say?
Oh, it was a big influence. Svevo introduced Joyce to a whole new way of thinking about literature. He was into psychoanalysis, which was pretty radical back then, and he explored his characters' inner lives in this really deep, complex way that wasn't typical in Italian writing.
So not just focusing on the external plot and action, but going deeper into the characters' minds, their motivations, their hidden stuff.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this really resonated with Joyce, who was already exploring similar things in his own work. They would spend hours talking about literature, philosophy, the nature of consciousness.
It sounds like a true intellectual meeting of the minds, a creative back and forth that pushed both of them further. Did they ever actually collaborate on any projects?
Not in the sense of co-writing anything, but they definitely influenced each other's work. Some scholars think Svevo's novel Zeno's Conscience directly impacted Joyce's Ulysses.
Wow. So we're talking a connection that maybe shaped one of the most important novels of the 20th century. What are the similarities between the two books?
Both novels really dive into the inner world of their main characters. They use this stream of consciousness style that captures how fluid and fragmented human thought is. They also have this shared sense of irony, this dark humor.
It's incredible to think that this friendship, formed in Trieste of all places, could have had such a ripple effect on literary history. Did Svevo influence Joyce's views on Irish nationalism too?
It's hard to say for sure, but it's definitely possible. Svevo was very cosmopolitan and really skeptical of nationalism. He saw it as this divisive force that ultimately caused more harm than good.
So maybe his perspective made Joyce even more disillusioned with traditional Irish nationalism.
Maybe. And don't forget, all of this is happening as Europe is getting more and more tense in the lead up to World War I. Both Joyce and Svevo were seeing the dangers of nationalism firsthand.
So Trieste becomes this microcosm of the bigger picture, a place where personal relationships, political beliefs, and world events are all coming together. It's a lot to process, but I think we're starting to understand how this period shaped Joyce, not just as a writer, but as a person.
It was definitely pivotal for him. It challenged him, changed him, and ultimately put him on the path to becoming one of the most important writers of his time.
And to think it all started with those lectures on Ireland he gave to an audience far from home. Who would have guessed they'd spark such a creative journey?
It just goes to show that sometimes the most unexpected paths lead to the most profound discoveries.
This has been an amazing deep dive. It's given me a whole new perspective on Joyce and his work. Before we go, is there one key takeaway, one last thought you want to leave our listeners with?
I think it's important to remember that even literary giants like Joyce are shaped by the places they live in, the people they meet, and the historical moments they live through. Their work doesn't come out of nowhere. It's a product of their experiences, their struggles, their victories.
So next time we're reading Joyce, we should keep in mind that those words aren't just abstract ideas. They're the result of a life lived, a life deeply connected to the complexities of his time.
Exactly. And maybe it'll inspire us to take a closer look at the places and people that have shaped our own journeys, our own understanding of the world.
That's a beautiful thought to end on. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the world of James Joyce. We'll see you next time.
Please go to finneganswakenotes.net for a full explanation of the text, and please don't forget to hit the like button.